She didn't expect the letter to find her. People like Claire Hansen weren't supposed to be located by anything official, not by mail carriers, not by collection agencies, certainly not by inheritance notices. But that November morning, huddled with Emma beneath the overhang behind Morrison's Diner in East Nashville, she watched a woman in a county jacket scan the alley with the determined confusion of someone who refused to believe an address could simply not exist. The woman held an envelope the way people hold live birds, careful but committed. Claire's first instinct was to disappear. 8 months of sleeping rough had taught her that official-looking people rarely brought good news. The embossed seal on the envelope caught the weak morning light. Tennessee Department of Probate Services. Emma, 10 years old and wrapped in the patched sleeping bag they shared, tightened her grip on Claire's arm. The gesture was so familiar now it hurt. Protection reflex. The kind of instinct no child should have mastered. The woman's eyes found them. Recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by the careful neutrality of someone trained not to judge circumstances. She approached slowly, boots crunching on gravel and frost. Claire Hansen. The name sounded strange spoken aloud. Claire had spent so many months being invisible that hearing herself acknowledged felt like being caught doing something wrong. Who's asking? Professional but not unkind, the woman consulted the envelope again, as if to verify she hadn't made a terrible mistake. County Probate Office. I've been trying to reach you for 3 months. 3 months. The distance between late summer and the first morning, the ground had frozen beneath their feet. The gap between sleeping in parks and sleeping behind dumpsters when the parks closed for the season. The woman extended the letter. It's about your grandmother, Margaret Hansen. The name landed like something physical. Margaret. A voice from childhood that Claire had spent 17 years trying not to hear. The small cabin in the mountains. The smell of pine sap and old wood smoke. The relentless way Margaret talked about the land like it had memory, like stones could hold grudges and trees could testify. Claire took the envelope slowly. Her fingers were stiff from cold and the particular exhaustion that came from never sleeping deeply enough to feel rested. She passed, already knowing, had known somehow for 2 years without anyone telling her. The certainty had arrived one winter morning as a feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the world, like a weight being lifted from a scale she didn't know she was balancing. The woman's face softened. 2 winters ago, the estate was delayed, complications with the property records. But you're listed as the last living heir. The property transfers to you. Property, the word felt absurd. Margaret had owned a sagging mountain shack in 80 acres of steep Tennessee woodland that nobody wanted. She died poor. Everyone knew it. The county had tried to take the land for back taxes twice while Claire was still a teenager, and Margaret had fought them both times with a fury that made grown men uncomfortable. Claire had always believed her grandmother owned nothing of value except stubbornness and the kind of pride that starved before it bent. Yet here was an envelope. Legal. Official. Something Margaret had left behind. Something that might have a door Emma could lock. She signed the delivery slip with fingers that could barely hold the pen. The woman handed over the envelope, offered a sympathetic nod that somehow made everything worse, and walked back toward the mouth of the alley where a county sedan waited with its engine running. Emma leaned against her mother. Where is it? Claire opened the envelope carefully, half expecting the paper to disintegrate like something from a dream. Inside was a deed printed on heavy stock that felt expensive and permanent. The legal description meant nothing to her. Township numbers, range markers, coordinates that pulsed on the page like something coded. But the address she recognized. Hanson Ridge Road, Sevier County. The eastern slope of the Smoky Mountains where the elevation got serious and the winters came early and stayed late. A handwritten note was paper-clipped to the deed. County letterhead, dated 3 weeks ago. Occupant rights valid. Beware structural weakness. Outbuilding condemned 1998. No taxes owed until reassessment. The kind of bureaucratic warning that tried to sound helpful but carried the faint smell of liability protection. Structural weakness could mean anything from a loose board to a collapsed foundation. Condemned outbuilding suggested something the county wanted demolished but couldn't afford to tear down. Still, it was a place. A structure with walls and a roof that might not leak too badly. An address that could receive mail, that could prove residency, that could open the tiny doors that led to bigger doors that led to the possibility of something resembling stability. Claire looked at her daughter. Emma's face was pinched with cold and hope in equal measure. We're going. Not home. Claire couldn't call it that. Home implied welcome, implied belonging, but it was a destination. And after 8 months of drifting, that felt like mercy. They gathered their things, 2 backpacks worn shiny at the stress points, the sleeping bag that smelled permanently of damp and diesel, a thrift store coat that had given up on insulation but still blocked some wind. Everything they owned fit into 2 hands. The bus to Gatlinburg left in 40 minutes. Claire counted the emergency fund. $37 in ones and quarters, enough for 2 tickets with $3 left over. Emma pressed close as they walked toward the station. The streets were filling with morning commuters, people who slept in beds and worried about traffic instead of where their next meal would come from. Claire felt invisible moving through them, a ghost passing through the solid world. At the station, she bought the tickets from a clerk who didn't look up from his phone. The bus was half empty. They took seats in the back where the engine noise would cover conversation and Emma could sleep without strangers watching. The city fell away behind them. Nashville's sprawl thinned into strip malls, then scattered houses, then the rolling Tennessee hills that deepened and darkened as they moved east. Emma's head found her mother's shoulder within 15 minutes, the exhaustion of chronic uncertainty pulling her under. Claire stayed awake, watching the landscape change. The road climbed steadily. Bare trees lined the highway like anatomical diagrams, all structure and no decoration. The sky was the color of old steel. She'd last traveled this route at 17. Running away from Margaret's cabin with nothing but anger and a bus ticket her mother had sent from Knoxville. She'd sworn never to return. Had built a life deliberately distant from these mountains. Nursing school in Memphis. Marriage to a man who'd seemed stable until the gambling debts surfaced. Emma's birth in a hospital that smelled like bleach and new beginnings. Then the divorce. The cascade of financial collapse that followed. The realization that every safety net she'd believed in was made of paper, and the first strong wind had torn it all away. Going back to the mountains felt like admitting defeat. Like the universe had a sense of humor dark enough to return her to the exact place she'd fled, only now broken, desperate instead of young and angry. The bus rattled through Sevierville, past Pigeon Forge with its tourist traps shuttered for the off-season, into Gatlinburg where the road began to climb seriously and the air thinned in that way that forced honest breathing. They got off at the last stop, the old gas station at the junction of 441 and Hanson Ridge Road had closed years ago. Plywood covered the windows. Graffiti proclaimed territories and heartbreaks in equal measure. Claire shouldered both packs. Emma walked beside her without complaint, though her legs had to be aching. The child had learned not to complain about physical discomfort. There were harder things to endure than tired muscles. Hanson Ridge Road was gravel and mud. It climbed through second-growth forest that crowded close on both sides. The trees here were older than the ones near Nashville, thicker, darker. They stood in the particular silence of mountains in late autumn, after the birds have migrated, but before the snow muffles everything into absolute quiet. Emma's breath clouded in front of her. What was she like? Grandma Margaret? Claire picked her words carefully. The truth was complicated. Margaret had been fierce and strange and utterly convinced of things that sounded like paranoia, until you lived in the mountains long enough to understand that isolation bred its own kind of clarity. Stubborn, kind in ways that didn't look like kindness. She believed the mountain taught you what you needed to learn. What did you learn? The path curved around a washout. Claire stepped over it automatically, muscle memory from childhood guiding her feet. I didn't stay long enough to find out. The lie tasted familiar. She'd learned plenty. That poverty was a trap that closed slowly enough you didn't notice until it was too late. That being right about something didn't matter if nobody believed you. That the world had no obligation to care about your truth, especially when your truth made powerful people uncomfortable. Margaret had tried to teach her those lessons. Claire had rejected them as the bitter philosophy of someone too stubborn to adapt. Now, 17 years later, she understood them in her bones. The path narrowed. Emma moved closer, small hand finding Claire's. They walked in silence for another half-mile. The forest opened gradually. Through the thinning trees, Claire saw it. The house looked exactly as bad as she'd feared, and somehow worse than memory suggested. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine. Boards had curled away from the frame, exposing dark gaps. The porch had surrendered to gravity completely, collapsing into a sprawl of lumber and weeds that looked almost deliberate, like modern art about decay. Windows were either missing or broken. The chimney listed slightly to the left. The whole structure seemed held upright by stubbornness and the skeletal support of its own frame. Emma's voice was small but not frightened. "It's really old." "It is, but it's ours." They approached slowly. Each step felt like walking into the past, into a version of herself she'd tried to bury. The yard was overgrown but not entirely wild. Someone had mowed at some point in the last year. The grass was short enough to see the ground. Claire reached the front door and stopped. It was closed but not locked. The handle turned easily, too easily. The hinges had been oiled recently. She could smell it. 3-in-1 oil, the kind Margaret used to keep in the kitchen for every squeaking hinge and sticky drawer. The door swung inward without protest. Inside, dust drifted in shafts of late afternoon light, but not thick dust, not the accumulated sediment of 2 years' abandonment. The floors were swept. The corners were clear. Someone had been here. Recently. Regularly. The living room still held Margaret's rocking chair. The runners were cracked, but the frame was solid. A cast-iron stove hunched in the corner, its surface clean of rust. The air smelled of old wood and something else. Time. The wild time Margaret used to hang in bundles from the ceiling beams. Emma walked in slowly, eyes wide. "It's like a story, one with ghosts." Claire set the packs down near the stove. Her voice came out quieter than intended. "Maybe, but we're the living ones here." The kitchen was through a doorway that had never had a door. The counter was rough-hewn wood, worn smooth by decades of use. A dry sink, a hand pump that probably didn't work, shelves with a few dusty mason jars still lined up like soldiers. Claire tried the pump. It resisted, then gave. Water coughed out brown, then cleared. Cold and mineral sharp. Someone had kept the well maintained. She opened drawers mechanically, looking for what she didn't know. Proof of occupancy, evidence of life. The third drawer stuck. Claire worked it gently until it slid open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. Heavy stock, the kind Margaret saved from important letters and reused for her own purposes. Claire unfolded it with hands that wanted to shake. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret's cramped, deliberate script. The letters formed with arthritic fingers but absolute intention. "If you're reading this, you found your way back. Good. The mountain's been waiting." Nothing else. No explanation. No sentiment. Pure Margaret. Say what needs saying. Nothing more. Claire tucked the note into her pocket. Her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. From the living room, Emma called out, "Mom, there's wood for the stove." A stack of split firewood sat beside the cast-iron stove. Dry, recently split, the cut surfaces still pale. Claire stared at it. Margaret had been dead for 2 years. Someone was maintaining this house. Oiling hinges, splitting wood, keeping the well clear. She pushed the thought aside. Survival first, mysteries later. They built a fire. The first match caught quickly. The kindling took with the eager hunger of dry wood and cold air. Within minutes, warmth began seeping into the room. Emma pulled the sleeping bag close to the stove and sat cross-legged, soaking in heat like a plant leaning towards sunlight. Claire found candles in a kitchen cabinet. 3 thick pillars, barely used. She lit them as darkness pressed against the windows. The house transformed in candlelight. Shadows softened the decay. The worn surfaces looked lived in rather than abandoned. She explored while Emma warmed herself. The hallway behind the kitchen was narrow and creaky. Each board announced her weight with sounds that ranged from whisper to complaint. At the end of the hall was the bedroom she'd shared with her mother during the brief years they'd lived here. Before her mother decided the mountains were suffocating and dragged 7-year-old Claire to Knoxville in search of something better that never materialized. The iron bed frame was still there. A quilt faded to the color of old newsprint covered the mattress. Dust lay thick on the windowsill, but the floor had been swept. The same pattern, recent maintenance, deliberate care. Claire approached the bed slowly, sat on the edge. The frame creaked, but held. Under the pillow, her fingers found paper, an envelope, sealed, her name on the front in Margaret's handwriting. She opened it carefully in the candlelight. Inside was a photograph and another note. The photograph was Claire at 7, standing in the same yard holding a bucket of wild blackberries. Her face was smeared with purple juice and huge smile. She remembered that day with painful clarity. The sun hot on her shoulders. Margaret teaching her which berries were ripe by feel as much as color. The satisfaction of a bucket filled by her own small hands. The note was brief. You were right to leave. I was wrong to keep secrets, but some truths need time to ripen. Cedar Ridge Trail, marker 7, follow Ranger. He remembers what I couldn't tell you. Claire read it 3 times. Cedar Ridge Trail ran behind the house deeper into the mountain. Marker 7 was about a mile up. She remembered it, a boundary marker from when the land was surveyed decades ago. But Ranger, Margaret's horse, a chestnut gelding she'd kept until he was ancient by horse standards. He would have been 26 when Margaret died. No horse survived 2 years alone in these mountains, except the wood was fresh split, the floor was swept, the hinges were oiled. Claire folded the note and photograph carefully, put them in her pocket with the first note. Evidence of Margaret reaching across death with the same stubborn insistence she'd brought to everything in life. She returned to the living room. Emma had curled up in the sleeping bag, eyes heavy. There's a bed. We can sleep warmer. Together they moved the sleeping bag to the bedroom, spread it over the quilt for extra insulation. Emma climbed in without hesitation. Exhaustion had lowered her standards for acceptable sleeping conditions months ago. Claire lay beside her daughter. The mattress was lumpy, but not terrible. Through the broken window, cold air drifted in, but the thick quilt and sleeping bag created a cocoon of relative warmth. Emma's voice was drowsy. It's better than the alley. It is. Are we staying? The question hung in the dark. Claire had no answer. Staying required plans she didn't have, resources that didn't exist, solutions to problems she hadn't begun to solve. For now, rest. Emma's breathing deepened within minutes. The absolute sleep of childhood, when the body demanded unconsciousness and got it regardless of circumstance. Claire stayed awake. The house settled around them with the particular sounds of old wood but adjusting to temperature changes. Beams contracting, joints shifting, the vocabulary of a structure that had weathered decades and wasn't ready to quit yet. Through the window she could see the tree line, dark shapes against slightly less dark sky, the mountains rising beyond like the curved backs of sleeping giants. A shape moved outside. Claire sat up slowly, watched. There, between the house and the forest, something large, moving with deliberate slowness. Her heart rate kicked up. Bear, her mind supplied immediately. Black bears were common here. They denned for winter, but a warm autumn could keep them active late. But the shape was wrong for a bear. Too tall, too angular. It stepped into a patch of moonlight, and Claire's breath caught. A horse. Chestnut coat with a silver blaze down the muzzle, moving stiffly but steadily toward the house, stopping 20 feet from the collapsed porch, looking directly at the bedroom window. Ranger. Impossible. Margaret's horse. 28 years old minimum. Horses didn't live this long, especially not alone in the wild. But there he stood, real, solid, breath steaming in the cold air. The horse met Claire's eyes through the broken window. The gaze was almost human in its intensity. Recognition flickered across that ancient equine face. She whispered without meaning to. You can't be here. The horse snorted softly, pawed the ground once, then lowered his head until his muzzle was inches from the window opening. Claire slipped out of bed carefully. Emma didn't stir. She moved to the window, heart pounding with the kind of adrenaline that had no clear outlet. The horse waited, patient as stone. She reached through the broken pane. Her fingers found the warm silk of his muzzle. He breathed against her palm, steady, real, impossible but undeniable. His breath misted in the cold. He nudged her hand gently, then her coat pocket. She frowned, reached in, pulled out the folded notes. The horse nudged them again, insistent but gentle. Claire unfolded the second note. Read it again by moonlight. Cedar Ridge Trail, marker 7. Follow Ranger. He remembers what I couldn't tell you. The horse stepped back, turned slowly, faced the tree line, looked back at her once, then began walking toward the forest. Every rational thought in Claire's head screamed that this was impossible. Horses didn't live 28 years. They didn't survive 2 winters alone. They didn't appear at exactly the right moment to guide people to mysterious destinations. But rationality had stopped being a reliable framework for understanding the world around the time she lost her job and her apartment in the same week. Reality, she'd learned, was more flexible than she'd been taught to believe. The universe had its own logic that didn't consult human expectations. And Margaret had never lied to her. Never. She'd kept secrets. She'd been difficult and strange and impossible. But she hadn't dealt in deception. The horse waited at the tree line. Claire looked back at Emma, sleeping deeply, safe for the moment in a house that was warmer than an alley. She grabbed her coat, pulled on her boots, checked that the kitchen matches were in her pocket and the small flashlight she'd shoplifted from a gas station 3 weeks ago. She paused at the bedroom door. "I'll be back soon," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. Then she stepped outside into the November cold and followed a ghost horse into the forest. Ranger moved slowly but with complete certainty. He knew exactly where he was going. Claire followed, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her. The trail was narrow and overgrown but still visible. Deer used it probably. Maybe hikers in summer. The trees closed in, tall oaks and hickories, their bare branches creating a lattice against the sky. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Claire's breath clouded thick in front of her face. The horse never looked back, just maintained his steady pace upward. After 20 minutes, Claire saw it. Marker 7, a weathered wooden post with a rusted metal tag stamped with the number. The official boundary of Margaret's 80 acres. Ranger turned sharply to the left, off the main trail onto a path so faint Claire would have missed it completely. They pushed through undergrowth. Branches caught at Claire's coat. The ground was uneven, rocks hidden under leaves waiting to turn an ankle. Then the trees opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a structure Claire had never seen before, or had forgotten so completely it felt new. A small building. Stone walls, maybe 10 feet by 12. Old. Older than the house, she could tell by the style of masonry. The kind of construction that predated modern tools. Hand-cut stone fitted together with the patience of people who measured time differently. The wooden door hung slightly crooked. Deep scratches marked its surface. Not weather damage. Something had tried to get in with metal tools recently. The gouges were fresh, the wood pale where it had been cut. The horse stopped in front of the building, turned to face Claire, waited. She approached slowly. The door had a simple latch, rusted but functional. She lifted it. The door swung inward with a groan of metal and wood that hadn't moved in decades. The smell hit first. Damp wood, rust, and underneath, something else. Metallic, faintly sweet, like minerals dissolved in water that had sat too long. She raised the flashlight. The beam cut across a room stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates, military style, stamped with faded logos and text. Claire stepped inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. The nearest crate bore a marking she could still read despite decades of fade. Summit Mining Corporation. Confidential, 1987. Her mind raced. Summit Mining, the company Margaret used to rant about. The thieves who stole from the mountain. The liars who drilled where they had no right. Everyone in town had thought Margaret was paranoid. The county had dismissed her claims. The company had threatened her with lawsuits for defamation. But here were crates, dozens of them, stamped with Summit's logo, hidden in a building nobody knew existed. Claire found a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall, wedged it under the nearest crate's lid. The wood resisted, then cracked. Nails screamed as they pulled free. The lid fell away. Inside, wrapped in canvas that had kept them protected for decades, were metal cylinders. Dozens of them, each about 18 inches long, 2 inches in diameter. Heavy. She lifted one carefully. It was warm. Not room temperature. Genuinely warm, like it held some internal heat source. Stamped into the metal cap were numbers, a date, 03-15-1987, and coordinates, not addresses, geographic coordinates in degrees and minutes. She unwrapped another cylinder. Same type, different date, different coordinates. These were core samples, geological surveys, drill cores taken from deep underground. The kind of thing mining companies use to assess mineral deposits. Emma's voice echoed in her memory from earlier that evening. What if it's nothing? Claire stared at the cylinders, at the crates stacked to the ceiling, at the Summit Mining logo repeated on box after box. This wasn't nothing. Margaret had been right. About the drilling, about the trespass, about all of it. And she'd hidden the proof in a place nobody would find it until Claire came home. Behind her, Ranger snorted sharply, his ears pinned back, muscles tensed under his coat. Claire spun. Through the open door, in the darkness beyond the clearing, something moved. Not an animal. The weight was wrong, the rhythm too deliberate. A branch cracked, loud in the night silence. 50 yards away, maybe less. Then another sound, fabric brushing against bark, boot sole scraping on stone. Someone was out there, watching. Ranger backed away from the doorway. The horse's fear was contagious, primal. Claire grabbed the nearest core sample, shoved it into her coat pocket, snatched 2 more for good measure. She pulled the door closed as quietly as she could. The latch clicked home with a sound that seemed deafening. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Claire could hear her own pulse, Ranger's breathing, the wind in the high branches. Then deliberately a flashlight beam cut through the trees, sweeping, searching. Claire didn't wait. She grabbed Ranger's mane and pulled herself alongside him. They moved together back toward the trail, fast but controlled. Every instinct screaming to run, but knowing that running blind on this terrain in the dark would end badly. Behind them, the flashlight beam found the stone building. Held there, a voice cut through the night. Male, older, not calling out, just speaking into a phone or radio. They found it. 2 words, quiet, matter of fact. Terror spiked through Claire's chest. They, plural. Someone had been waiting for this, expecting it. She and Ranger reached the main trail. The horse broke into a careful trot. Claire ran alongside, hand tangled in his mane for balance. Her lungs burned. The core samples banged against her ribs with each step. The flashlight beam swung toward them. Too far to illuminate, but close enough to track movement. Then she heard the second beam, coming from another direction. Flanking. 2 people, maybe more. The house appeared below through the trees, warm light from the candles visible through the windows. Emma was in there, alone, unprotected. Claire's legs found strength she didn't know she had. She crashed through the last of the undergrowth and stumbled into the yard. Ranger stopped at the edge of the tree line, watching. His role as guide complete. Claire ran to the front door. It was still unlocked, exactly as she'd left it. She slipped inside, closed it, locked it with the old bolt that probably wouldn't stop anyone determined. Her hands shook as she checked the windows, looking for movement, for flashlight beams. Nothing. The forest was dark and silent again. She checked the back of the house, the kitchen window that faced the mountain. It had been fully closed when they arrived. Now it was open an inch, just enough to slip fingers through and lift. Someone had been here, in the house, while she was gone. Fresh boot prints marked the kitchen floor. Mud, recent, leading from the back door to the hallway, to the bedroom. Claire's vision tunneled. She ran to the bedroom. Emma was still there, still sleeping, undisturbed. But someone had stood in this room. The boot prints stopped at the foot of the bed. Someone had looked at her daughter while she slept. Claire's hands clenched. The core samples in her pocket dug into her ribs. She checked the rest of the house, found nothing else disturbed, closed and locked every window that still had a working latch, dragged the heavy rocking chair in front of the back door. Then she returned to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed with her back to the wall and her flashlight in her hand. Outside, Ranger stood guard in the moonlight, patient as death itself. Claire didn't sleep. She watched the windows, listened to every sound. The house settling, the wind moving through empty places, the particular quality of silence that forms when danger stops announcing itself and just waits. Emma slept on, innocent of the fear that had her mother's heart racing, innocent of the boot prints that had stopped inches from her sleeping face. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Claire's exhausted mind finally began to process what had happened. Margaret had hidden evidence of something big enough that people were still watching for it 36 years later. Big enough to maintain a surveillance on an abandoned house. Big enough to follow Claire and her daughter the moment they arrived. The core samples in her pocket suddenly felt heavier than their actual weight. Whatever Margaret had discovered, whatever Summit Mining had done, it wasn't over. And now Claire and Emma were standing directly in the middle of something they didn't understand. The mountains held secrets, Margaret used to say. They remembered what people tried to forget. Claire stared at the tree line as the sun rose behind it, painting the bare branches golden red. She believed it now. The mountains remembered, and someone else remembered too. Morning arrived cold and sharp. Claire sat against the bedroom wall, still dressed, the flashlight dead in her hand. Emma woke slowly, blinking in the gray light filtering through broken windows. The child took in her mother's rigid posture without comment. 8 months homeless had taught her to read danger in silence. Claire's voice came out rougher than intended. "We need to go into town." She wrapped one of the core samples in a kitchen towel. The metal cylinder felt warm even through the fabric, a physical impossibility that her exhausted mind couldn't process. The other 2 samples she hid beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet, covering them with the same dust and debris that had concealed the hiding spot. They ate stale crackers from Emma's backpack, drank water from the hand pump. The normalcy of breakfast felt obscene given what Claire had witnessed in the dark. Outside, Ranger stood exactly where he'd been at dawn. The horse's presence should have seemed impossible, but Claire's capacity for disbelief had limits, and she'd exceeded them sometime around 2 in the morning. She approached him carefully, laid her palm against his neck. "Thank you." The horse's ear flicked. He lowered his head to graze the short grass, unconcerned. The walk into Gatlinburg took 90 minutes. Emma asked no questions, a restraint that hurt worse than curiosity would have. They passed 2 other hikers on the trail down. Both offered friendly nods. Normal people doing normal things in a world that felt anything but. The town smelled of wood smoke and tourist season emptiness. Most shops were closed until spring. The few locals on the streets moved with the efficiency of people conserving energy for the long winter ahead. The library sat on a side street, brick and glass, built in the optimistic expansion of the 80s. Claire pushed through the double doors into warm air that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Behind the circulation desk, a woman with steel gray hair, twisted into a tortoiseshell clip, looked up sharply. Her eyes were the pale blue of deep ice, assessing and immediate. "You look like you need answers, not directions." Claire set the wrapped core sample on the desk. The towel fell away. The woman's expression shifted, not surprise exactly. Recognition mixed with something darker. "I haven't seen one of those in decades." Her fingers didn't touch the cylinder, but they hovered close enough to feel the residual warmth. Claire kept her voice level. "I found crates of them, behind my grandmother's house." The librarian's gaze sharpened. "Who was your grandmother?" "Margaret Hanson." The name landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of memory crossed the woman's face. She stood slowly, movements deliberate. "Margaret came here once, 15 years ago, maybe more. She was shouting about stolen land, corporate theft. She had documents, maps, samples like this one." The woman's voice dropped. "We called security, had her removed. She was making the other patrons uncomfortable." Shame colored the admission. The specific regret of someone who'd chosen order over truth and lived long enough to question the choice. "I'm sorry, we should have listened." Claire's throat tightened. The apology meant more than the woman could know, proof that Margaret hadn't been paranoid or delusional, just early. "Can you tell me what this is?" The librarian studied the cylinder. "Drill core sample, geological survey. I worked for the Forest Service before this job. We use them to assess mineral deposits." She gestured toward the back of the library. "Dr. Walsh is here today, retired geology professor from University of Tennessee. Tuesdays are his map days. He'd know more." She led them through the stacks to a reading room where maps covered every available surface. Topographic surveys, mineral surveys, watershed maps. A tall man stood hunched over a table, magnifying glass in hand, examining contour lines with the intensity of someone reading scripture. Dr. Thomas Walsh looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts. Too tall, too thin, stooped from decades of peering at things smaller than they should be. His flannel shirt was worn soft at the elbows, wire-rimmed glasses magnified eyes that missed nothing. The librarian made brief introductions and left them alone. Walsh approached the core sample like it was religious artifact, lifted it carefully, turned it toward the window light. His fingers traced the stamped numbers with practiced familiarity. Spodumene. See this pale band? Lithium-bearing mineral. He rotated the cylinder slowly. High grade, maybe 1.5% lithium content. Beautiful specimen. His voice carried the detached appreciation of someone who'd spent a career studying rock composition, but his hands trembled slightly. Do you know what lithium was worth in 1987? Almost nothing. Electric car batteries didn't exist. Grid-scale storage was science fiction. This mineral was industrial waste. He set the core down with exaggerated care. Do you know what it's worth now? $80,000 per ton. The number hung in the air. Claire's mind struggled to process it. She'd found dozens of these cylinders, maybe hundreds in those crates. Walsh pulled out a geological survey map of Sevier County, spread it across the table with the reverence of someone handling original scripture. Where exactly did you find this? Claire pointed to the approximate location of the stone building. Walsh measured coordinates with a ruler, cross-referenced with the numbers stamped on the core sample. His face went white. This coordinate is 400 feet north of Summit Mining's lease boundary. He looked up at Claire with something approaching awe. They drilled on your grandmother's land, illegally. His finger traced the property lines, and they found one of the richest lithium deposits in the eastern United States. Emma had been silent throughout, but now she moved closer to study the map. Her small finger followed the property boundary. How much is under our land? Walsh did rapid calculations on a notepad, numbers accumulated with terrifying speed. Your grandmother owned 80 acres. Based on this core depth and lithium content, I'd estimate 2 to 3 million tons of recoverable ore. He wrote a final figure and pushed it toward Claire. Current market value somewhere between $160 and $240 million. The room tilted. Claire gripped the table edge. Your grandmother was sitting on a fortune, and Summit Mining stole it. The word should have brought triumph, vindication for Margaret's decades of accusations. Instead, Claire felt the weight of understanding settle across her shoulders. People had followed them last night, watched the house. Someone had maintained that property for 2 years, keeping it ready, waiting. For this. For evidence worth more than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. Walsh was already moving, gathering maps, pulling reference books from shelves. You need legal representation. Someone willing to fight a corporation with deep pockets and no conscience. He scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. Sarah Chen, best litigation attorney in 3 counties. She handles cases on contingency, which means you don't pay unless you win. The address was local, a white house on Oak Street converted to office space. Walsh's eyes were bright with something Claire recognized as righteous anger. Margaret tried to tell people 30 years ago. Nobody listened because she had no proof they couldn't destroy or discredit. He tapped the core sample. Now you have proof. Don't let them silence you the way they silenced her. The walk to Sarah Chen's office took 10 minutes. The White House sat behind a crooked sign that read, "No appointment, no problem," in hand-painted letters. The front porch doubled as a waiting room, empty at midday. Inside smelled of coffee and old wood. A woman in her early 40s sat behind a desk buried under case files. Her black hair was pulled into a severe bun. Dark eyes assessed Claire and Emma with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. Sarah Chen didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sit. Tell me everything. Claire laid out the sequence. The inheritance, the stone building, the crates stamped with Summit Mining logos. Walsh's analysis, the men in the forest, the boot prints in the house. She produced the core sample. Chen examined it without touching. Dr. Walsh sent you? Yes. Then the mineral analysis is solid. He's the best we've got. Chen pulled a yellow legal pad from a drawer, started taking notes in shorthand that looked like encryption. Mineral trespass. Statute of limitations is 10 years from discovery. You discovered it 2 days ago. Clock starts now. She leaned back, fingers steepled. Summit Mining Corporation, current market capitalization $4.8 billion. Their Tennessee lithium operation generates $600 million in annual revenue. The numbers were delivered flatly, without emphasis, just facts that needed stating. Built entirely on reserves they extracted from land they didn't own. Chen slid a contract across the desk. I work on contingency. If we win or reach settlement, I take 33%. If we lose, you owe nothing. She tapped the core sample with one manicured nail. But this has teeth, real teeth. Are you prepared for what that means? Claire's voice was steadier than she felt. Tell me. Summit will fight. They'll claim the samples are forged, the coordinates falsified. Your grandmother was mentally incompetent. They have lawyers whose only job is making problems disappear. Chen's expression hardened. They'll investigate you, dig into every mistake you've made, every vulnerability. They'll use your homelessness, your divorce, anything that makes you look unstable or desperate. She glanced at Emma. They'll question whether you're a fit parent, whether you're using your daughter to gain sympathy. The threat was delivered clinically, but Claire felt it like a physical blow. Emma's hand found hers under the table. Can they take her? Not if we're prepared, not if we document everything, follow every rule, and build a case so airtight they can't find oxygen. Chen pushed the contract closer. I've been waiting 15 years for a case like this. A clear villain, compelling facts, and a plaintiff whose story matters. She met Claire's eyes. But I need to know you won't break, because they will come at you with everything, and I mean everything. Claire thought about the boot prints by Emma's bed, the men in the forest, the 2 years someone had watched that house waiting. They already started. Something fierce crossed Chen's face. Good, then we won't waste time pretending this is civil. Claire signed the contract. Her handwriting looked shaky next to Chen's precise signature, but it was legally binding. Chen immediately began organizing. She drafted a statement for Claire to sign, contacted Walsh about providing expert testimony, started building a timeline of Summit's operations in the area. We need more than one core sample. We need to document everything in that building before Summit can claim it's contaminated evidence. She grabbed her phone. I'm calling the county sheriff. We'll get those crates photographed and cataloged today. Official record before anything disappears. The next 3 weeks blurred into a sequence of depositions, document reviews, and meetings with people whose expertise Claire barely understood. Walsh prepared a 47-page technical analysis of the core samples, complete with mineralogical assays and geographic surveys proving the drilling occurred outside Summit's lease. The librarian produced meeting minutes from a county commission hearing in 1987. Margaret's name appeared 3 times. Each mention dismissed her claims as unsubstantiated and lacking credible evidence. The commission had voted unanimously to take no action. Then Jack Holloway appeared, 72 years old, spine curved from decades of manual labor, hands gnarled with arthritis. He walked into Chen's office on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a ledger so old the binding had disintegrated into loose pages. I was a drill technician for Summit, 35 years. His voice was gravel and regret. I kept records they told me to destroy. The ledger contained daily logs of drilling operations, dates, locations, depths, supervisors, technical details that meant nothing to Claire, but made Chen's eyes go wide. Holloway pointed to entries from March 1987. Off-lease drilling, Hanson property, 340 feet. The dates matched the core samples exactly. In the margin, handwritten in faded pencil, were initials. J.H. That's me, Jack Holloway. I logged every sample I pulled. He turned to another page. More entries. More coordinates that fell outside Summit's legal boundaries. Supervisor ordered silence. Said we'd all be terminated if word got out. I had a wife, kids in school. I needed the job. His hand shook. Margaret Hanson came to the drilling site once. Demanded to know what we were doing. Security ran her off, called her crazy. Holloway looked at Claire. I'm 72, stage 3 lung cancer. I'm not scared anymore. His jaw set. Margaret died alone. People called her paranoid. That's on me. I knew she was right and said nothing. He pushed the ledger toward Chen. Now I'm going to make it right. Chen's response was immediate. She drafted Holloway's sworn affidavit, had it notarized the same day, added it to the evidence file that was growing thicker daily. Summit's response came within a week. A stack of legal documents 4 inches thick. Denials of every allegation. Claims that the core samples were forgeries, the coordinates fabricated, the ledger a crude attempt at fraud. Their lead attorney, Marcus Brennan, requested an immediate dismissal hearing. The county courthouse was newer than the library, but carried the same institutional smell. Bleach and bureaucracy. The hearing room was small, designed for preliminary motions rather than full trials. Brennan arrived with 2 junior attorneys and a paralegal carrying 3 briefcases. He was 51, silver-haired, with the kind of face that photographed well and projected competence. His suit probably cost more than Claire had earned in 6 months of nursing. Judge Patricia Calloway presided with the exhausted patience of someone who'd seen every variation of corporate malfeasance and had stopped being surprised. Brennan's opening was smooth, practiced. He positioned Margaret as a troubled woman who'd harassed Summit for decades, suggested the core samples had been planted recently, implied that Claire was exploiting her grandmother's mental instability for financial gain. Mrs. Hanson was non-compos mentis, her claims delusional. Multiple county officials can testify to her erratic behavior. Chen rose slowly. When she spoke, her voice carried none of Brennan's polish, but had something harder underneath. Poverty isn't mental illness, Your Honor. It's what happens when corporations steal from the powerless and then gaslight them when they fight back. She presented Walsh's analysis. Holloway's ledger. The county meeting minutes showing Margaret's claims were dismissed without investigation. Summit wants this dismissed because discovery will expose 3 decades of systematic theft. They're not protecting their reputation. They're protecting their profits. Judge Calloway studied the evidence for 10 minutes. The courtroom was silent except for the clock above the bench ticking toward a decision that would determine whether Claire's fight ended before it began. Finally, Calloway looked up. Motion to dismiss is denied. This case proceeds to discovery. Summit will provide all records of drilling operations in Sevier County from 1985 to 1995. Her gavel fell. Final. Brennan's face remained neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes as he passed Claire on his way out. That evening, Emma noticed the car first. Mom, that car's been behind us since town. Claire checked the rearview mirror. A dark sedan, nondescript, following at exactly the legal distance. She took an unnecessary turn. The sedan followed. Another turn. Still there. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. The truck they'd borrowed from Chen rattled over the rutted mountain road. The sedan maintained position. It followed them all the way to Hanson Ridge Road, then stopped at the junction. Watched. Didn't follow onto the private drive, just made sure Claire knew she was being observed. The next day, their front tire blew on the way down the mountain. Claire pulled over, cursing. Examined the damage, not wear, not a puncture from road debris. A 4-inch nail driven straight through the tread at a perfect 90-degree angle. She walked the road, found 5 more nails, placed at even intervals across the gravel. Deliberate, calculated. Emma's voice was small. Someone put those there. Claire called Chen, documented everything with photographs, filed a police report. The deputy who responded was polite but skeptical. Could be kids, happens sometimes. His eyes said he didn't believe it. He knew exactly what this was. 4 days later, they returned from a meeting with Walsh to find the bedroom window shattered. Not cracked, completely destroyed, glass scattered across the floor in a pattern suggesting deliberate force. Nothing stolen. But someone had walked through every room. Moved drawers, checked closets, searched. Fresh boot prints marked the kitchen floor. Size 13, work boots with a distinctive tread pattern. The prints led from the back door through the hallway to Emma's bed. Stopped there. Claire photographed everything. Called the sheriff. The same deputy responded. This time he didn't suggest kids. You should consider staying somewhere else until your legal situation resolves. Translation, you're making powerful people uncomfortable, and I can't protect you. The electrical service cut off 3 days later. Claire called the utility company. Outstanding balance of $840. I paid that 2 weeks ago. Our records show non-payment, Service restoration requires 7 to 10 business days after balance clears. Chen made calls, discovered the payment had been misrouted by a system error, demanded immediate restoration, got promises but no action. They lived without electricity, used the wood stove for heat, candles for light, the hand pump for water. Emma adapted with the resilience of children who'd already survived worse. But Claire saw the fear creeping back into her daughter's eyes, the hypervigilance that had started to fade returning with doubled intensity. On a Thursday evening, an SUV blocked the road. Claire stopped the truck 30 feet back. Ranger, who'd taken to following them partway down the mountain each morning, tensed beside the vehicle. A man stepped out, hands visible, movements non-threatening. Marcus Brennan, dressed down in jeans and a wool coat, looking almost approachable. "Miss Hanson, I think we should talk." Claire killed the engine but didn't get out. "We have nothing to discuss outside court." Brennan approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "I'm not here in an official capacity. This is neighbor to neighbor." His smile was practiced, sincere enough to be insulting. "We both know where this is heading. Years of litigation, mounting legal costs, uncertainty." He leaned against his vehicle with calculated casualness. "Summit is prepared to offer $500,000. Cash settlement. You sign over mineral rights, we part as friends." The number was enormous, life-changing. Everything Claire hadn't had for so long, the concept felt theoretical. That's generous compensation for what amounts to a property dispute. Claire's laugh was sharp. "If you're offering $500,000, the land is worth 10 times that." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. "Court is unpredictable. Juries are fickle. You could spend 3 years fighting and walk away with nothing." He pushed off the SUV, took a single step closer. "Think about your daughter. She needs stability, certainty. That money provides both. What it provides is silence." Brennan's professional mask slipped fractionally. "Mountain roads are dangerous, Miss Hanson. Accidents happen, especially in winter, especially to people who aren't familiar with the terrain anymore." The threat wasn't even thinly veiled. It was there. Naked and deliberate, Claire held his gaze. "If I make a mistake, it'll be mine. Not because someone scared me into it." She restarted the truck. Brennan stepped aside, but his voice followed her. "You're making enemies you can't afford." 2 days later, Emma was walking home from the bus stop. The route was a mile of gravel road through forest. She'd made the walk dozens of times. A black pickup drove slowly beside her. Matching her pace, the passenger window rolled down. "Tell your mom smart people take the money. Kids need safe homes, not legal battles." The truck accelerated away before Emma could respond. She ran the last quarter mile, burst into the house shaking. Claire called Chen immediately, then the sheriff, then the FBI field office in Knoxville. Witness intimidation. A federal crime. An agent took Emma's statement, documented the vehicle description, promised investigation. But promises didn't stop the black pickup from appearing again 2 days later, parked at the end of Hanson Ridge Road. Just visible from the house. Watching. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Claire woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke from the stove. Chemical. Wrong. She ran to the window. The stone building was burning. Flames 50 feet high, turning night into orange day. She grabbed her phone, called 911, then sprinted toward the blaze. Ranger was already there, circling the perimeter, panicked but unable to approach the heat. The fire was too hot, too fast, professional. Claire tried to get close with a bucket from the well, but the intensity drove her back. Dr. Walsh appeared from the direction of his property 1/2 mile away. Jack Holloway from the opposite direction. They formed a line, passing buckets, but it was futile. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later. By then, 40% of the building had collapsed. The remaining structure was unsalvageable. As dawn broke over smoking ruins, a state fire investigator walked the perimeter with a camera and evidence bags. He found the gasoline can in the underbrush. Size 13 boot prints in the mud. Tire tracks from a vehicle that had parked 50 yards away. Professional arson. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. But 60% of the crates had survived. The core samples Claire had removed were safe. The ledger was in Chen's office safe. The evidence was diminished but not destroyed. The investigator photographed everything, documented the accelerant placement, the timing designed for maximum damage with minimal risk of spreading to the main forest. Chen arrived as they were bagging evidence. Her face was stone. They're rattled, desperate, which means they're scared. She turned to Claire. Good. Fear makes people sloppy. Walsh provided detailed documentation of the remaining crates, photographed and cataloged each core sample. His report grew to 83 pages. Irrefutable, the FBI opened an official investigation into the arson, subpoenaed phone records, found a private investigator named Douglas Mercer whose calls pinged off cell towers near the property the night of the fire. Mercer's bank account showed a $25,000 wire transfer from a Summit Mining Consulting account 3 days before the blaze. Pressure mounted. Summit stock dipped 2% on rumors of an investigation. Shareholders demanded answers. The CEO faced awkward questions during a quarterly earnings call. Then Chen's phone rang. She put it on speaker in her office. Claire and Emma present. This is Marcus Brennan. I'm calling to discuss settlement. Chen's voice was ice. I'm listening. $3.2 million. Final offer. Your client signs a comprehensive release, transfers mineral rights, and this ends. The number was staggering, more than Claire had imagined possible. I'll need to review the terms with my client. Fine, I'm having the contract couriered today. You have 48 hours. He hung up. The contract arrived 3 hours later. 47 pages of dense legal language. Chen read it twice, then a third time with a yellow highlighter marking sections. She looked up at Claire. Section 14, subsection C, non-disclosure agreement. Perpetual and binding on you and your heirs. She flipped pages. You can never discuss this case. Never write about it. Never mention Summit Mining in any public forum. Emma inherits that silence. More pages. Future claims waiver. You give up any right to sue for additional damages, even if evidence emerges of worse conduct. She set the document down. They're offering $3.2 million to bury a $200 million crime. The room was silent except for Emma's breathing and the tick of the wall clock. Chen's voice was careful. It's your decision. This is life-changing money. I won't judge whatever you choose. Claire stared at the contract, at the number with all those zeros, at the signature line that would end the fear and the watching and the boot prints by her daughter's bed. She thought about Margaret dying alone, called crazy by people who refused to see truth when it made them uncomfortable. The mountains remembered what people tried to forget, but only if someone refused to let the forgetting happen. Claire pushed the contract back across the desk. Tell them no. Chen drafted the counteroffer that same evening. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, building demands that would either force Summit into real negotiation or expose how much they feared discovery. $4.5 million. No non-disclosure agreement. Mineral rights limited to underground extraction only, surface and water sources untouchable. A written admission that Summit conducted off-lease drilling on Hansen property between 1987 and 1991. $200,000 for a scholarship fund bearing Margaret's name. She sent it at midnight. The timestamp deliberate. Let them know she worked harder than they did. Brennan's response came at 6 the next morning. Your client is overreaching. We'll see her in court. But the offer wasn't withdrawn. That was the tell. Summit still wanted settlement. They just needed to be forced into accepting they couldn't dictate terms. The FBI agent assigned to the arson case was named Patricia Voss, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the particular wariness of someone who'd spent 2 decades watching powerful people avoid consequences. She arrived at Chen's office carrying evidence bags and a subpoena for Summit's phone records. We found Douglas Mercer, private investigator with a history of corporate dirty work. His phone shows 47 calls to Summit's main number in the month before the fire. She laid out call logs, timestamps, duration, a pattern of communication that looked exactly like what it was. Wire transfer of $25,000 from a Summit Consulting account to Mercer's LLC 3 days before your building burned. Voss set down photographs, boot prints, tire tracks, the gasoline can with partial fingerprints that matched Mercer's service record from his brief stint in the Army. Enough for federal charges, arson, witness intimidation, conspiracy. I'm recommending prosecution. Chen leaned back, fingers steepled. What does that do to our civil case? Strengthens it, proves malicious intent, shows a pattern of criminal conduct. Juries love sending messages to corporations that think they're above the law. But Voss's expression carried a warning. It also means years of trials, criminal first, then civil. Your client and her daughter living under threat the entire time. Claire absorbed this sitting across from Chen's desk. Emma was at the library with Walsh, learning geology because education couldn't stop just because their lives had become a legal battlefield. How long? Criminal trial, 18 months minimum. Appeals could add 2 years. Civil case can't proceed until criminal concludes. You're looking at 4 years, maybe 5. 5 years of watching over her shoulder. 5 years of Emma growing up afraid. 5 years of Summit's resources grinding against their endurance. Voss continued, or Summit realizes the criminal exposure makes settlement cheaper than fighting. Federal charges create shareholder liability. Board members start asking uncomfortable questions. Sometimes that pressure accomplishes what righteousness can't. The pressure arrived faster than expected. Summit's stock dropped 8% over 3 days as news of the FBI investigation leaked to financial reporters. The CEO faced hostile questioning during a CNBC interview about alleged criminal activities in Tennessee operations. Shareholders filed a demand for the board to investigate. The kind of internal review that started friendly and turned vicious when numbers got uncomfortable. Brennan called Chen on a Friday afternoon. His voice had lost the smooth confidence of earlier conversations. We need to talk, off record. They met at a coffee shop in Knoxville, neutral territory, where neither side had home advantage. Brennan arrived alone. No junior attorneys, no paralegal with briefcases. Chen brought Claire. Deliberate. Make him look at the person he'd threatened. Brennan ordered coffee. Neither of them would drink. When he spoke, exhaustion edged his words. The board is nervous. The FBI investigation creates exposure beyond this case. They want it resolved. Then accept our counteroffer. I can't. Not all of it. The admission of wrongdoing, the scholarship fund, those are non-starters. Chen's expression didn't shift. Then we proceed to trial. Let discovery expose everything. Brennan's jaw tightened. Discovery goes both ways. We'll subpoena every aspect of your client's life, her employment history, her divorce, her eviction. We'll paint her as an opportunist who abandoned a mentally ill grandmother and now exploits her death. Claire spoke for the first time. Do it. I've got nothing left to lose except my daughter, and you already tried threatening her. Something crossed Brennan's face. Not quite shame, but recognition that the tactics he'd relied on weren't working. 2.9 million, mineral rights underground only, surface protected, no NDA. You're free to discuss the case publicly. He paused. But no admission of wrongdoing. Summit won't put that in writing. Instead, we fund the scholarship at $150,000. We don't attach Margaret's name publicly, but you can. Call it whatever you want. Chen pulled out her phone, started calculating. After taxes and my fee, Claire nets about 1.4 million. Enough to secure her future, protect the land, give Emma education and stability. She looked at Claire. Or we go to trial, 60% chance we win bigger, 40% chance we lose everything. Either way, it takes years. The coffee shop was nearly empty. Afternoon light slanted through windows, illuminating dust motes like they were something profound. Claire thought about Margaret spending 30 years fighting alone, about Emma's childhood being consumed by litigation instead of being young. Truth mattered, but survival mattered too. And sometimes wisdom meant knowing when you'd won enough to matter. I want one more thing, one sentence in the settlement agreement. Not an apology, just acknowledgement. Brennan's eyes narrowed. What sentence? Summit Mining acknowledges off-lease drilling occurred on Hanson property between 1987 and 1991. The lawyer's face went carefully blank. That single sentence would be admissible in other cases. Would open Summit to liability from every property owner adjacent to their operations. Would cost them millions in future settlements. That's not minor. That's a landmine buried in contract language. Then detonate it now or risk worse in discovery. They sat in silence. Brennan's coffee grew cold. Outside, traffic moved past in the indifferent rhythm of a city that didn't care about the negotiations happening in this corner booth. Finally, Brennan pulled out his phone, made a call that consisted mostly of listening, his face growing tighter with each passing second. He hung up. They'll do it. One sentence, buried in Section 22, subsection F. Factual acknowledgement, not admission of liability. Legal hair-splitting, that meant everything. Chen spent the weekend reviewing the revised settlement, 47 pages that she annotated with 2 colors of highlighter and extensive margin notes. On Monday, she presented Claire with a summary. Total settlement, $2.9 million. Federal taxes at 24%, state at 5%. That's $841,000 to the government. Leaves $2,059,000. My contingency fee is 33% of gross, $680,000. She wrote the numbers clearly. Your net, $1,380,000. The figure sat there on the yellow legal pad, more money than Claire had imagined having in a lifetime. Enough to erase years of fear about tomorrow. Chen continued, I recommend you use it like this. $220,000 for complete house renovation. Professional contractors, proper permits, bringing everything to code. $60,000 for rangers, barn, and care, including provisions for rescue horses, if you want. More notes. $150,000 into a trust for Emma's education. That covers undergraduate and graduate school, adjusted for inflation. $250,000 for a conservation easement through Tennessee Land Trust. Locks the property forever, prevents any future mining. She looked up. $200,000 in emergency savings, high-yield accounts, FDIC insured, $500,000 in diversified investments, index funds, bonds, boring and safe. The plan was comprehensive, practical, built by someone who understood that sudden money destroyed people who didn't respect it. This gives you security without making you wealthy enough to be reckless. You'll need to work eventually, but not desperately. Emma grows up stable. The land stays protected. Claire signed the settlement agreement that afternoon. Her signature looked shaky next to the corporate attorney's confident scrawls, but it was legally binding. The wire transfer hit her new bank account at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. $2,059,000. The number on the screen looked fictional. Chen took her fee immediately. Professional, clean. She'd earned every dollar fighting a corporation that outweighed them by billions. The first thing Claire bought was new boots for Emma, then a winter coat that actually insulated, small things that represented the distance they'd traveled from sleeping behind dumpsters. The story broke 3 days later. Someone leaked the settlement terms to the Knoxville News-Sentinel. Claire suspected Holloway, who'd spent 35 years watching Summit evade consequences and seemed determined to ensure this time was different. The headline was brutal. Mining giant admits decades of illegal drilling in secret settlement. The article detailed the core samples, the off-lease drilling, Margaret's ignored warnings. It quoted Section 22, subsection F verbatim. That single sentence Summit had tried so hard to avoid. The Nashville Tennessean picked it up. Then the Chattanooga Times Free Press. Regional papers hungry for a David and Goliath story with corporate malfeasance and vindication for a woman dismissed as crazy. Summit's stock dropped another 6%. The CEO announced his retirement, effective immediately, a resignation that fooled nobody. Shareholders demanded investigations. The board retained an outside counsel. Internal emails started surfacing in discovery for other cases, showing executives knew about the illegal drilling and authorized cover-ups. 3 families in surrounding counties came forward with their own stories of suspicious drilling, trespassing surveyors, and warnings from Margaret Hanson that they dismissed. A class action lawsuit formed. Summit faced liability that made Claire's settlement look like pocket change. Marcus Brennan's name appeared in the internal emails. Instructions to manage the Hanson situation quietly. Approval of payments to Mercer. Knowledge of intimidation tactics. The Tennessee Bar Association opened an investigation. Professional conduct violations. Conspiracy to commit witness tampering. Subordination of perjury in his prepared motions claiming the core samples were forged. 6 months after the settlement, Brennan was disbarred. His law license revoked permanently. His career as an attorney ended with bureaucratic finality. Claire learned about it from a newspaper article. No triumph accompanied the knowledge. Just the quiet recognition that consequences eventually found even people who thought themselves immune. She saw him once, months later, a chance encounter on a Knoxville street. Brennan was leaving a commercial real estate office, carrying a box of personal effects. His face had hollowed. Beard stubble suggested he'd stopped caring about appearances. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. He looked away first, walked past without acknowledgement. That was the moment. Not courtroom drama or public shaming, just a man who'd wielded power carelessly, discovering it could be taken away. Douglas Mercer fared worse. Federal charges for arson and witness intimidation. 15 years minimum. He took a plea deal that still meant 8 years in a medium security facility. Summit Mining closed their Tennessee operations 6 months after settlement, called it operational restructuring. Everyone understood it as retreat. 200 people lost jobs. The town of Gatlinburg felt the economic impact immediately. Local resentment toward Claire grew in direct proportion to unemployment numbers. Someone spray-painted "Greed kills jobs" on the side of Chen's building. The grocery store owner refused to sell to Claire. Emma got shoved in the school hallway by a classmate whose father had worked Summit's processing plant. The cost of justice wasn't just legal fees and emotional exhaustion. It was neighbors who stopped waving, people who'd once been friendly crossing the street to avoid conversation, but others stepped forward, quietly. The librarian brought Emma books without being asked. Walsh invited Claire to community meetings about watershed protection. Holloway organized a fundraiser for the families who'd lost Summit jobs, and Claire contributed anonymously. 18 months after settlement, the house transformation was complete. The roof was new, metal panels and deep charcoal that would outlast Claire and probably Emma. Triple-pane windows kept heat in and weather out. New electrical wiring brought the house into the 21st century. Solar panels on the south-facing slope provided enough power to sell excess back to the grid. The porch was rebuilt from pressure-treated lumber and composite decking that wouldn't rot. A fresh coat of cream paint made the exterior look intentional rather than accidental. Inside, the floors were refinished oak. The kitchen had granite counters and cherry cabinets. A modern heat pump replaced the wood stove, though Claire kept the old cast iron as decoration because Margaret would have appreciated the gesture. The bedroom where Emma slept had new drywall, insulation, and a window that locked securely. The bathroom had hot water on demand and a shower that didn't require heating water on the stove first. It was still recognizably Margaret's house. The bones hadn't changed, but the structure had been loved back to life. Ranger's barn sat 50 yards from the house, 20 by 30 feet, with rubber mat flooring that protected aging joints. Infrared heaters kept the temperature above freezing, even in January. Automatic waterers ensured fresh supply without hauling buckets. Ranger shared the space with 2 other horses. Rescues from an auction where they'd been headed for slaughter. An Appaloosa mare with a crooked foreleg and a bay gelding too old for anyone to want. The 3 of them stood in the paddock on spring mornings, sunlight catching their coats, living proof that being unwanted wasn't permanent. Emma had started at Gatlinburg Elementary in January. The transition was rough. She was behind in math, ahead in reading, and carried the social wariness of a child who'd learned not to trust easily. But she made 1 friend, then 2. By spring, she had a small group that ate lunch together and traded books during recess. Claire enrolled in an online nursing program. Her license was still valid, just dormant. 6 months of coursework would bring her current with practice standards. The local clinic had already indicated interest in hiring her once certified. The conservation easement was finalized in March of the 2nd year. $250,000 to Tennessee Land Trust in exchange for permanent protection. The 80 acres could never be developed, logged commercially, or mined. The agreement bound Claire, Emma, and every future owner in perpetuity. Summit's mineral rights, acquired through the settlement, reverted to state ownership when the company abandoned its Tennessee operations. The governor quietly transferred them to the Department of Conservation, ensuring they'd never be exploited. The stone building that had burned was rebuilt, not restored, transformed. It became a memorial, funded partially by the settlement and partially by community donations that surprised Claire. People who'd known Margaret, who remembered her warnings, who felt ashamed they hadn't listened. Walsh and Holloway installed a bronze plaque beside the entrance. Margaret Hanson, 1941 to 2023, keeper of proof. Below it, smaller text, She told the truth before anyone profited from hearing it. Inside, behind glass, were 3 core samples, the ones that had started everything, labeled with their coordinates and mineral content. A timeline on the wall documented Margaret's 30-year fight, county meeting minutes, her handwritten letters to officials, Summit's denials, the evidence she'd hidden, the vindication that came too late for her to witness. The local school district started bringing 4th graders on field trips. The librarian led tours, explaining how corporations could harm communities and how one person with the documentation could challenge power. Claire watched from the doorway during the first tour, listened to children ask questions about her grandmother, heard the librarian call Margaret a hero who nobody recognized. It didn't undo Margaret's lonely death, didn't erase the years people called her paranoid, but it changed the story from tragedy to legacy. The town slowly shifted its narrative. The initial resentment about lost jobs evolved into recognition that Summit had been exploiting the community for decades. Property owners started questioning whether their land had been violated. Environmental groups tested water sources and found contamination that predated Claire's lawsuit. The mayor proposed the Margaret Hanson Water Protection Act, legislation requiring mining companies to disclose their all drilling activity within 1 mile of residential water sources. It passed unanimously. A year later, 3 more families filed suits against Summit's successor companies. All referenced Section 22, subsection F from Claire's settlement. That single sentence became the key that unlocked dozens of cases. Claire testified as an expert witness twice. She didn't enjoy it, but understood the responsibility. Her grandmother had fought alone. Claire wouldn't let others face the same isolation. On a December evening, snow fell softly across the ridge. Claire and Emma sat on the rebuilt porch, hot chocolate steaming in their hands. Below them, Gatlinburg's lights flickered through the trees. Emma's voice was thoughtful. Did Grandma's secret really change things? Claire considered. Summit was gone. The water was cleaner. The land was protected. Families who'd been dismissed now had legal precedent to fight. It shook the part that needed shaking and reminded people that truth buried is still truth waiting. Below them, Ranger grazed in the paddock, impossibly old, impossibly alive, impossibly present for all the moments that mattered. Emma leaned against her mother. Are we rich now? Claire smiled. The question made sense from a child who remembered counting coins for bus fare. Rich enough to keep the land safe, rich enough to give you choices. She thought about the investment accounts, the emergency fund, the scholarship trust. Security measured in boring financial instruments that would never make headlines, but would protect Emma's future. But we're rich in something else. We get to finish her story. Emma's hand found hers, small fingers and larger ones, warmth against the December cold. The house stood behind them, solid, repaired, ready for decades more of weather and time. A structure that had survived abandonment and arson to become home. Claire thought about the journey from Nashville's alleys to this porch, the inheritance that had seemed like desperation but became vindication. The choice to fight when taking money would have been easier. Margaret had left more than property. She'd left proof that standing alone against power wasn't madness. It was integrity waiting for the world to catch up. The night deepened, snow accumulated in the yard, softening edges, covering the scars where the old porch had collapsed. Nature's way of moving forward without forgetting. Emma's breathing slowed, the exhaustion of a full day pulling her towards sleep. Can we stay here forever? The question held the weight of a child who'd moved too many times, who associated stability with temporary conditions. As long as you want, this is ours. The land trust makes sure of that. Not just legally theirs, spiritually theirs, connected to Margaret's stubbornness, in Claire's refusal to be silenced, in Emma's resilience through circumstances no child should endure. Inside, the renovated house waited, warm, solid, equipped with appliances that worked and systems that functioned. Everything Margaret had died without, but would have appreciated for her family. They went in together. Claire locked the door behind them. A simple gesture that meant something different than it had a year ago. Not protection against immediate threat, but the ordinary security of people who belonged. Emma fell asleep quickly in her room with the window that locked and the heat that stayed consistent. Claire checked on her twice out of habit, though the need for hypervigilance was fading. In the living room, Margaret's rocking chair sat in the corner, restored but not replaced. The wood had been treated, the runners reinforced, but it was still recognizably the chair where an old woman had sat plotting how to preserve truth until someone could use it. Claire sat in it now. The motion was soothing, back and forth, the rhythm of continuity. On the wall hung a photograph she'd found in Margaret's papers. 3 generations, Margaret young and fierce, Claire's mother tentative and already looking elsewhere, Claire herself at 7, holding blackberries and grinning with purple-stained teeth. Beside it, a newer photo, Claire and Emma outside the memorial, the plaque visible in the background, both of them smiling in a way that suggested they'd survived something and knew it. The mountains held them with the patient grip of things that had witnessed human struggles for millennia and would witness millennia more. They didn't judge, didn't demand, just offered the possibility of belonging to people willing to accept their terms. Outside, the night was quiet except for wind through trees and the occasional sound of Ranger shifting in his stall, the old horse that had somehow survived to guide them exactly when guidance mattered most. Claire thought about the men who'd followed her that first night, the boot prints by Emma's bed, the fire that destroyed half the evidence but couldn't destroy the truth. They tried to make her afraid, succeeded, honestly. Fear had been her constant companion for months, but fear and courage weren't opposites. Courage was fear that kept moving forward anyway. That signed counteroffers and rejected settlement terms and stood in front of powerful men without flinching. Margaret had possessed that courage, had wielded it alone for 3 decades. Claire had inherited it, not through genetics, but through necessity and example, and the refusal to let her daughter grow up believing that might made right. The rocking chair creaked softly. Outside, snow continued falling, accumulating in the trees, covering the scars of last year's fire, creating the conditions for next spring's growth. Emma would grow up here, would learn the mountain's lessons at a pace that didn't crush her, would understand that some fights took years and some victories looked nothing like triumph. She'd know her great-grandmother not as a crazy old woman, but as someone who protected truth when nobody else would, who died before vindication, but died right. That was worth more than the settlement, more than the house or the barn or the security in the bank. It was the inheritance that actually mattered. Claire stood, turned off lights, checked locks one final time, climbed stairs that didn't creak anymore to a bedroom that held heat through the night. Through the window, she could see the memorial building, dark now but present, solid. A monument to the idea that one person with evidence could challenge institutions designed to silence them. The mountains remembered, Margaret used to say. They held secrets in stone and soil, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Claire had listened, had followed an impossible horse to hidden evidence, had made choices that prioritized truth over comfort. The consequences had been real, the fear legitimate, the cost higher than she'd anticipated. But lying in bed in a house that was warm and paid for and permanently protected, with her daughter sleeping safely down the hall, Claire understood what her grandmother had known all along. Some truths demanded telling regardless of personal cost, not because the telling would be rewarded, but because silence was corrosion. It ate away at the foundation of what it meant to live with integrity. Margaret had told the truth when it cost her everything and gained her nothing. Claire had told it when the stakes were different, but the principle identical. And Emma would grow up understanding that integrity wasn't convenient. It was necessary, the bedrock that everything else built upon. Outside, the wind shifted, the temperature dropped, winter settling in with the absolute commitment of Tennessee mountain weather. But inside, the house held warmth. The structure Margaret built and Claire restored stood firm against whatever storms were coming. They were home, finally, completely. Not because they'd found shelter, but because they'd found the place where their story and Margaret's story and the mountain story converged into something larger than individual struggle. They belonged to this land in the way that truth belonged to evidence and courage belonged to fear that refused to retreat. The mountains would remember. The memorial would teach. The protected acres would endure. And 3 generations of women who'd fought when fighting was all that remained had proven that power could be challenged and corporations could be stopped. And one person really could change everything. If they refused to be silent. If they kept the proof. If they remembered that truth buried is still truth waiting.
Swingt auf me. Alles gut. Ich habe Molly nochmal reingemacht.
Er ist gerade zurückgegangen in die Lobby.
Okay. Ich jump Peak für euch.
Passt vielleicht auf Main.
Mitte wahrscheinlich, ja.
Mitte auf.
Könnte auch hier
Kann
links
sein,
an
dass er
meiner
die
Board
Op
stehen.
mitgenommen hat.
Ja, er hat wahrscheinlich auch gesaved.
Der hat wahrscheinlich die Op mitgenommen. Und ist rausgegangen. Also aufpassen.
Ja. Da steht ja ihr Elbow drin.
Er hat die Op mitgenommen.
Nice, schön.
Wichtig.
Sehr gut. Ich habe den Mitspieler geholt, hat funktioniert geil. Nice, nice.
Immer die Leute, die kein Geld haben hier.
Ja.
Das ist eine sehr aggressive Vibe-Hold, ja. Okay, ich mache wieder Standard-Wall.
Einfach sportlichen Bego.
Okay.
Nochmal Presi, die Wall. Mach nochmal die Presi auf B.
Yes,
Weil
yes.
jetzt wissen die ja nicht, ob es ein Fake ist oder richtig.
On my way.
Das heißt, jetzt zeigen sie erstmal nur Sova und...
Ja, Presi. Wieder die Drohne.
Ich halte euch Elbow. Ich halte euch Elbow.
Drop die Wall wieder.
Also ich dachte, ihr wollt
Ich hab mal
reinrennen.
Mitte...
Das Backside.
Ja.
Nee.
Ich
Zwei
hab
auf
mal
jeden Fall
Mitte
B. Einer
geflasht.
Broken Wall und einer links.
Dann halt du hier, dann halte ich hinten, dass uns keiner überrennt von hinten.
Enemy spotted B.